A grieving mother, abandoned at her child's funeral, discovers her own family plotting to seize her son's $850,000 trust. What began as heartbreak spirals into a brutal war of betrayal, lies, and a revenge so calculated, it leaves scars no court ruling can heal. The day of Caleb's funeral is carved into my memory with the precision of a knife. September air hung heavy, damp and sharp with the smell of fallen leaves. Rows of mourners lined the small cemetery, their black coats stirring in the wind. But my parents weren't there. My sister wasn't there. The people who should have stood closest to me at the darkest moment of my life chose absence. I remember clutching Caleb's favorite action figure, the one he used to sleep with every night, and lowering it into the coffin before they closed it forever. My hands shook, but my voice was steady when I whispered, "Sleep tight, buddy. Mama's here." When the service ended, I stood alone. Angela, my dearest friend now, though back then she was just a neighbor who, shown up with coffee and casseroles, put an arm around me. "Where's your family?" she whispered, her brows knitting in confusion. I forced a bitter smile. "Preparing for Victoria's wedding, I guess. Priorities." Even then, I knew the truth. Caleb's illness, his endless hospital stays, the financial strain, the fear. It had been too inconvenient for them. They had always treated him like a reminder of my mistakes. To them, his funeral was an obligation they could skip. But what I didn't know was that their absence wasn't just neglect. It was strategy. 2 weeks later, the sheriff knocked on my door. His face was neutral, professional, but his eyes carried pity. He handed me a thick envelope stamped with the county seal. My fingers felt numb as I tore it open. Petition for emergency guardianship of estate. At first, I couldn't even process it. My parents, the ones who couldn't bother to show up to bury my son, were petitioning the court to take control of his $850,000 trust. The money Ethan's parents, Caleb's grandparents on his father's side, had set aside for his care, his future, and now for me. My breath hitched as I flipped through the pages. Every line dripped with venom dressed as concern. She is emotionally unstable. She is unable to manage finances responsibly. She isolates herself to a concerning degree. I pressed a hand against my chest, fighting the wave of nausea. My sister Victoria's name was listed as a co-petitioner, and Melissa's affidavit, Melissa, my best friend since college, was stapled to the back. She had written that I was paranoid, hysterical, unfit to manage anything, let alone a large sum of money. My knees buckled, and I dropped onto the couch, the papers sliding from my hands to the floor. Angela picked them up gently, scanning the words. Her jaw tightened, her eyes darkened. "They want to strip you of everything," she murmured. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "They want to erase Caleb. They couldn't love him in life, and now they want to consume what's left of him in death." That night, sleep never came. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker, feeling the storm of betrayal tighten around me. My parents, my sister, my best friend, they had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. Grief was supposed to bind families together, but my family had smelled money and tragedy, and like vultures they circled closer. I promised myself then, with a clarity that burned in my bones, they would regret it, not just losing Caleb's trust, but losing me. They wanted war. I would give them war, but not with screams or fists or even tears. No, my revenge would be slow, precise, undeniable. I would let them destroy themselves with their greed, while I sharpened the blade of truth, and in the end, they would choke on the very lies they used to bury me. The courthouse loomed like a cathedral of judgment, its polished marble steps reflecting the pale morning sun. I stepped inside, clutching my briefcase, not papers, not plans, but the fragments of my sanity, the shield I had built around myself since Caleb's death. The moment I entered the courtroom, their faces struck me like a punch to the gut. My parents, Victoria and Melissa, sat together like a perfect poisonous unit. Their expressions were carefully sculpted, sorrowful, righteous, untouchable. But I knew better. I had seen the cracks, the glimmers of greed that no makeup or rehearsed frown could conceal. Across from them, Richard Donovan, my attorney, arranged his files with methodical precision. Angela hovered behind me, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the judge entered. Her silver hair gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, her eyes sharp as knives. Judge Marion Peabody had the reputation of being merciless with liars, and merciful only to the innocent. I prayed I counted as the latter. The proceedings began with a cold efficiency. Their lawyer, a predator in a Savile Row suit, painted me as a hysterical, unhinged mother, incapable of rational thought or financial responsibility. He spoke of erratic behavior, of dangerous isolation, of obsession that jeopardized her son's welfare. Every word was a calculated dagger. Then Melissa took the stand. I watched her body tremble slightly, but her voice was steady. calmly, almost rehearsed. Destiny became obsessive during Caleb's illness, she said, avoiding my gaze. She called me constantly, at all hours. It was frightening. I felt bile rise in my throat. Every memory she twisted. The sleepless nights at the hospital, the frantic attempts to stabilize Caleb, the quiet prayers whispered into his ear, was now a weapon against me. My mother followed, dabbing at invisible tears with a lace handkerchief. "We're heartbroken," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. We had to protect our daughter from herself. And my sister Victoria sat silent, but the faint curl of her lips betrayed satisfaction. They were confident. They thought they could destroy me with a story of a grieving mother gone mad. Then Richard stood, calm but commanding. "Your Honor," he began, his voice slicing through the courtroom, "what we are witnessing is not concern. It is a deliberate, premeditated campaign of exploitation." Piece by piece, he dismantled their lies. Hospital records were entered as evidence, every appointment, every night spent at Caleb's bedside, every medication logged. He called the hospital administrator, who confirmed Victoria's unauthorized access to private files, a severe HIPAA violation. The murmurs began, a soft ripple that grew louder with each revelation. Angela took the stand next. Her words were simple, clear, and piercing. "I watched Destiny care for Caleb every single day. I never saw her falter. She was his rock, his hero. Her love kept him alive." Even Ethan's father testified, "My son set up that trust for one reason, for Caleb and for Destiny if the worst happened. He said, she sacrificed everything for him. She'll honor his memory better than anyone." The tide in the courtroom shifted. The judge's eyes, once softened by my family's performance, now scrutinized them with suspicion. Her gaze hardened, cutting through their masks. And then, the final blow, the security footage. Richard played the video from my porch. Victoria's voice, stripped of false sweetness, filled the room. "We'll destroy your reputation completely. Everyone will know how unstable you are. You think you deserve that money? You were always the burden, the disappointment." The air went still. My mother's face fell. Victoria's lips twitched, an unguarded flicker of fear passing over her features. Melissa avoided looking anywhere but the floor. The judge called a brief recess, the tension in the room almost physical. When she returned, her expression was unreadable, but her words cut deeper than any scream. "This court finds no basis for the guardianship petition. The evidence presented by the petitioners is manipulative, misleading, and indicative of a coordinated attempt to exploit a grieving mother for financial gain." The gavel fell. My parents and sister could barely rise, their empire of lies crumbling around them. A permanent restraining order was granted, the trust unfrozen, and an investigation into perjury announced. Outside the courtroom, I felt light for the first time in weeks. The sun on my shoulders was no longer just warmth. It was permission to breathe, to step forward, to reclaim my life from the vultures who had circled my grief. Yet even in victory, a seed of something darker took root. They had humiliated me, attacked me when I was weakest, and tried to erase my son. This wasn't over, not in spirit, not in my mind, because justice in court, while satisfying, is fleeting. Revenge is eternal. I began to understand that the war had just begun, and I intended to win it in a way they would never forget. Slowly, meticulously, invisibly, they had underestimated me, and I would make them pay. Even after the courtroom victory, I could feel the weight of their betrayal pressing down like a storm cloud that refused to break. Grief had already hollowed me out, but their actions had carved a new wound, one that throbbed with raw, relentless anger. My parents, my sister Melissa, the people I had trusted, loved, even relied on, they weren't just absent when Caleb needed them. They were predators circling his life, waiting for the moment they could strike. The weeks after the ruling were a blur of legal paperwork, press interviews, and the haunting silence of our home without Caleb. I moved through it mechanically, but my mind was sharp, alive with a cold clarity I had never known. I started noticing patterns, subtle digs from Victoria in emails, small lies Melissa spread to mutual friends, whispers from my parents pretending they cared about my well-being. Each act was minor alone, but together they formed a lattice of deceit that tightened around me. One evening, as I sat in Caleb's empty room, I held his blanket and let the tears come. But this time, they were not just grief. They were fury. Fury at a world that could be so cruel. Fury at those who had made the ultimate betrayal personal. I realized something terrifying yet liberating. I no longer needed them. Their approval, their love, even their presence. None of it mattered. Then came the message that changed everything. An anonymous tip pointing to emails Victoria had tried to delete, evidence of her scheming to manipulate the trust even before Caleb's funeral. And Melissa's journal, obtained through a friend who had grown suspicious of her sudden loyalty shift, revealed the full extent of her lies. She had fabricated stories of my instability, twisting every moment of panic, every sleepless night, every call for help into ammunition. I read it all, alone in the night, and something inside me snapped. The grief that had once consumed me transformed into a focused, burning determination. I would not just survive this, I would make them pay in a way they could never anticipate. My parents reached out, pretending to apologize, offering hollow words about family and healing. I responded with calm, calculated politeness, all while recording their calls. Every conversation, every attempt at manipulation, I cataloged. Each word became a piece of evidence, each false sentiment a blueprint for their eventual undoing. Victoria, meanwhile, continued her attempts to slander me subtly. Social media posts, mutual acquaintances, whispers in the right ears. But I had already anticipated it. I watched her closely, noting the patterns, the times she was most vulnerable. And Melissa, the friend I had once trusted with my heart, proved the easiest to read. Guilt and fear flickered in her eyes every time she lied. I began to track her movements, her communications, cataloging each betrayal with meticulous care. The breaking point wasn't a single moment. It was a culmination, the realization that those I had loved most had attempted to steal the life of my son's legacy, had tried to destroy me in the process, and had smiled while doing it. It would have been easy to scream, to lash out violently, but I had learned the hard truth. Fire can be uncontrolled. Fire can destroy the wrong thing, the wrong people, even yourself. What I needed was ice. I needed patience. I needed strategy. I began to plan. Small, precise moves at first. Subtle public appearances to counteract Victoria's gossip. Strategic legal consultations to anticipate their next manipulations. Quiet conversations with those who could be allies in this war. Every interaction was a chess piece. Every reaction carefully noted. At night, I would lie awake in Caleb's empty room, imagining the courtroom again. Only this time, I wasn't the defendant. I was the architect. Every move they made, every lie they told, would be their undoing. And I would be there, watching, waiting, orchestrating the collapse with cold, deliberate patience. It was terrifying to admit. I was no longer just a grieving mother. I had become a strategist, a hunter cloaked in sorrow and fury. The innocence I had clung to after Caleb's death was gone, replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. And so, the stage was set. I had all the pieces I needed, their greed, their lies, their overconfidence. I just had to wait for the right moment to strike. Not recklessly, not emotionally, but with precision. The game had begun, and in the quiet of the night, I whispered to the empty room, "You tried to break me. You failed. But soon, you will understand just how far I can go." The war had shifted, no longer about survival. Now it was about retribution. Revenge isn't loud. It isn't fiery. It's slow, deliberate, and relentless. I learned that in the nights spent alone, the nights when the world slept and grief had faded into a quiet, simmering anger, I had been given the blueprint. Their greed, their arrogance, their overconfidence. Each betrayal had been documented, each lie cataloged, and now it was time to turn it all into something unstoppable. I began with observation. Victoria, my sister, the one who had smiled while my son's coffin was lowered, was predictable. She thrived on social appearances, on public perception, on the illusion of control. Every dinner she attended, every social media post, every whispered conversation could be manipulated. And Melissa, the friend-turned-enemy, was equally predictable. Her guilt made her cautious, but also desperate for validation. And my parents? They were the easiest, the simplest. They craved respect, approval, the illusion of moral superiority. I didn't rush. I watched. I recorded. I listened. Angela became my confidant, my partner in this subtle war. She helped me track patterns, anticipate moves, and plan responses that seemed effortless to the outside world, but were meticulously orchestrated behind the scenes. First, I needed to destabilize them without raising suspicion. Victoria's social circle became my playground. A carefully placed comment here, a suggestion there, slowly eroding her credibility. Friends began to question her stories, to notice the inconsistencies. I never directly attacked. I merely allowed the truth to surface, hidden in plain sight. The irony was intoxicating. Victoria, who had thrived on manipulation, had no idea she was being manipulated in return. Melissa required a different approach. I subtly fed her half-truths, small manipulations that played into her guilt. Every lie she had ever told about me became a thread, and I began pulling. Anxiety crept into her demeanor. Fear flickered in her eyes whenever she thought I wasn't watching. It was delicious, seeing the once bold betrayer reduced to someone cautious, hesitant, second-guessing every step. And my parents, their pride would be their undoing. I orchestrated situations where their hypocrisy would be visible to others. Small events, casual gatherings, seemingly innocent questions about my son's legacy or their financial maneuvers. The more they tried to appear benevolent, the more their lies revealed themselves. Friends and family began to whisper, noticing contradictions, questioning intentions. Legal strategy remained central. Richard, ever patient and precise, advised me to strengthen my position for any potential future attacks. We documented every encounter, recorded conversations, secured evidence. But I didn't just rely on the law. I relied on psychology. I understood them now, their weaknesses, their fears, their vanity. And every move I made was a reflection of that understanding. I also built alliances, people who had been victims of Victoria's manipulations, people who had witnessed Melissa's lies, neighbors who had watched my parents' hypocrisy, all became quietly aligned with me. I didn't need armies. I needed truth amplified, evidence revealed subtly, like sunlight piercing a fog. Most importantly, I worked on myself. I kept my emotions in check, honed my focus, and transformed my grief into fuel. Every night in Caleb's empty room, I rehearsed conversations, anticipated lies, imagined their reactions. The anger was no longer a consuming fire. It was a precision tool, guiding my planning, sharpening my resolve. And then came the small moves, moments designed to test, provoke, and reveal. A carefully worded social media post about Caleb's memorial foundation, a casual mention of legal consultations in the right ears, a dinner with mutual acquaintances where their contradictions became evident. Every move was invisible, yet visible enough to sow seeds of doubt and fear. I realized, too, that patience would be my greatest weapon. They were impulsive, greedy, desperate for validation. I was calm, deliberate, methodical. The war was not about confrontation. It was about erosion. Slowly, imperceptibly, their foundations would crumble under the weight of their own lies. And in that quiet planning, I felt a strange satisfaction. Not satisfaction at cruelty, but at inevitability. The scales had been unbalanced for too long. They had taken from me what they could never give back. Now they would face consequences they could never escape. I whispered to the shadows, to the memory of Caleb that lingered in every corner of our home. I will honor you, not with fury, but with justice. They will pay, and it will be quiet. It will be complete. The game had begun, and I was the unseen hand pulling all the strings. The first moves were small, almost imperceptible, but each one landed with precise intent. I wasn't looking for dramatic explosions or public confrontations. Those belonged to amateurs. My battlefield was subtle. Words whispered to the right ears. Documents slipped into the correct hands. Social perceptions quietly reshaped. Victoria was the first to feel the consequences. She prided herself on control, social appearances, whispered influence, everyone thinking she was untouchable. I began with her social circle, friends she had manipulated for years, casual questions, subtle reminders of past inconsistencies, strategically timed compliments that carried hidden doubt. A friend would mention, almost innocently, "Remember when Victoria said," and the seeds of uncertainty took root. I never accused, never confronted directly. The truth, once nudged, is far more terrifying than lies. Melissa was next. Her lies about my mental state had been bold, confident, and careless. She had underestimated me. I introduced small, controlled leaks of information that contradicted her stories. A conversation overheard, an email accidentally seen, and I watched her posture change. Hesitation, fear, guilt. Every interaction became a test of her composure, and each failed test revealed just how thin her armor was. My parents required patience, the slowest burn of all. Their pride and reputation were their greatest weapons, and therefore their greatest vulnerability. I began by arranging casual encounters where their hypocrisy would surface. Questions about Caleb's foundation, subtle mentions of financial oversight, indirect conversations where their duplicity would be evident to others. It was exquisite to see them squirm under the weight of their own pretense, every lie exposed by the light of scrutiny they had ignored. Legally, I fortified myself. Richard meticulously prepared for any retaliatory moves, but I didn't wait for him alone. I prepared psychological traps, small provocations designed to push them into missteps. Every call, every email, every interaction with them was cataloged. Their words, once casual weapons, became ammunition for me, evidence of their true intentions. The most satisfying strikes were silent, almost invisible. A carefully timed social media post highlighting Caleb's memorial foundation. Invitations to community events subtly emphasizing transparency and integrity. Casual mentions to trusted contacts about my ongoing work, underscoring my resilience and clarity. These were small, seemingly innocent acts, but each one chipped away at their credibility, subtly amplifying their mistakes and contradictions. I also exploited their vanity. Victoria loved recognition, Melissa craved approval, and my parents thrived on respect and status. I orchestrated situations where each would expose themselves without realizing it. The words they spoke in confidence to the wrong person, the subtle misstep in social conversation, the overreach that revealed greed, they were falling into my carefully laid traps, one by one. At home, Caleb's room became my strategy center. I mapped timelines, reviewed records, tracked patterns, and rehearsed moves. Angela became my confidant and strategist. She provided insights I could not see alone. Together, we were no longer grieving observers. We were hunters, orchestrating a slow, devastating campaign. And while I moved quietly in public, privately, the storm raged in me. I didn't want them to see the fire I had contained, the fury I had refined into precision. Every time I thought of Caleb's smile, the way he trusted me, the nights I held him through pain and fear, I felt a sharpened focus. This was more than revenge. It was reclamation. The first successes were subtle but powerful. A friend of Victoria's called to question her story. Melissa hesitated in a meeting, her credibility fractured. My parents were caught contradicting themselves in front of witnesses who had once blindly trusted them. Each micro-victory reinforced my confidence, but I knew the real test was yet to come. I whispered to the night, to Caleb's memory, to the empty walls around me, this is only the beginning. They will unravel, and every move they make will lead them closer to the truth. They won't see me coming, but when they fall, they will understand. The war had entered its subtle, invisible phase. The first moves were out, and the battlefield was quiet, yet the tension was electric. Each day, each interaction, each smile and each lie brought me closer to the inevitable climax. I was no longer just a mother fighting for her son's legacy. I had become an architect of retribution, a silent force moving through their lives, and soon they would realize that underestimating me had been their gravest mistake. The day it began to unfold, I felt an almost electric calm. Years of grief, betrayal, and meticulous planning had led to this point. I wasn't nervous. Fear had long since been replaced by purpose. Each of my enemies had a weakness I had cataloged, every lie, every misstep recorded and ready to be exposed. Now, it was time to let them collapse under their own weight. Victoria was the first domino. Her social circle had already begun whispering doubts, but I struck the decisive blow. A close friend of hers, someone she had confided in for years, received proof of Victoria's manipulation. Emails she thought were private falsified statements about my mental state, and clear evidence of her attempts to profit from Caleb's trust before his death. The revelation was surgical. Victoria's world, built on charm and control, crumbled in hours. The whispers turned into confrontations, trust evaporated, and the facade of power she had spent decades constructing fell away. Melissa's undoing was even more exquisite. Her web of lies had grown tangled, her guilt magnified with every small trick I had set in motion. I orchestrated a scenario in which her own statements, half-truths, and fabrications were presented to people who mattered. Friends, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances saw the contradictions, the manipulations, and the betrayals in stark clarity. Melissa's confidence, once her armor, shattered. I watched from a distance as she stumbled, trying to explain herself to a room full of people who had once believed her. It was justice, subtle but devastating, and completely irreversible. My parents, the architects of cruelty and greed, were the hardest to dismantle, but their pride betrayed them. Carefully planted witnesses, casual but precise questions, and the small revelations I had orchestrated for months converged in public scrutiny. Friends, neighbors, and distant relatives began noticing discrepancies in their stories. The lies they had spun about my supposed instability now hung like heavy stones around their necks. For the first time, they were powerful powerless, their credibility evaporating with each passing hour. The courtroom had been one victory, but the world outside, social, personal, professional, was the real arena. Every lie they had told, every betrayal, every cruel smirk during Caleb's funeral resurfaced in ways they could neither defend nor deny. I watched quietly as their reputations unraveled, as subtle social attacks and whispered truths dismantled the empire of control they had built over decades. And through it all, I remained composed. Angela was my steady hand, my confidant, my witness to the transformation from grief to calculated power. Together, we observed as my enemy's world, once meticulously curated, began to collapse. The satisfaction was deep, but silent, never loud, never vengeful in a way that could be traced back to me. The revenge was clean, untraceable, unstoppable. The pinnacle came during a memorial event for Caleb's foundation, where I publicly announced new initiatives funded in his honor. Every calculated move I had made, the subtle exposure of their lies, the careful orchestration of truth, the patient watchfulness of their weaknesses, had reached its conclusion. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel pride, but it was tempered by the awareness of what this process had done to me. Revenge had required patience, strategy, and an unflinching focus on every detail. It had required me to look into the darkest corners of my grief and turn that pain into an instrument of justice. As the day ended, I returned to Caleb's room. The walls were quiet, the memories palpable. I knelt beside his bed, touching the blanket, and whispered, "They understand now, Caleb. They can never take from you again. They see your legacy, and mine." The revenge was complete, not with screams, not with chaos, but with precision, patience, and the subtle exposure of truth. Their world was fractured, their influence shattered, and their power over me obliterated. And yet, beneath the satisfaction, a lingering truth remained. Vengeance had a cost. I had been reshaped by it, hardened, sharpened, and changed in ways that no one could see. The war was over, but its echoes would remain within me forever. I had won, but I had also paid the price for that victory. The storm had passed, the battlefield cleared, and yet I felt no triumph in the way I had imagined. The court victories, the public vindication, the collapse of my parents, sister, and former friend, they had brought justice, but they had also left a hollow echo inside me. Revenge had been precise, devastating, undeniable, but it demanded a cost I hadn't fully anticipated. I returned home to Caleb's room, the one place untouched by their greed or lies. His blanket still smelled faintly of him. The action figure I had lowered into his coffin long ago now rested gently on his pillow. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, reminding you of all that was lost and all that had been gained. Angela helped me organize Caleb's foundation, which had grown into something meaningful. Grants for families, research funds, scholarships for children with rare blood disorders. Every effort was a tribute to him. And yet, as we celebrated milestones, I realized that the satisfaction of revenge could not fill the void grief had carved. It could not bring back the nights spent soothing Caleb through pain, the mornings when his laughter had been my sunrise. My parents no longer dared to speak to me. Victoria's reputation had crumbled. She avoided public appearances, her social circle fractured by the revelations I had orchestrated. Melissa withdrew, her lies exposed, her influence evaporated. They were defeated, but the victory felt strangely muted. I had dismantled their world, yes, but in doing so, I had been forced to stare into the abyss of my own grief, anger, and obsession. The nights were hardest. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, and feel the weight of what I had done. Revenge is a sharp, precise instrument, but it leaves marks on the wielder. I had become strategic, calculating, patient beyond normal human endurance, but I had also hardened. Every interaction, every relationship since Caleb's death was measured, filtered, carefully considered. Trust was no longer freely given. It was earned painstakingly with proof. Yet, in the quiet moments, there were glimmers of peace. The first anniversary of Caleb's passing arrived. I stood by his grave, flowers in hand, sunlight brushing my shoulders. I whispered his name, feeling the gentle warmth of memory rather than the sharp sting of loss. And then a small hand touched mine. A little girl, shy, holding her mother's hand. "Excuse me? Are you Destiny Walker?" Her mother explained that the girl, Emma, had been diagnosed with the same rare blood disorder as Caleb. Thanks to the foundation, she had access to treatment that worked. Emma looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes and whispered, "Thank you for helping me get better." Tears filled my eyes, not of grief, not of rage, but of pride, love, and hope. I knelt beside her, whispering to the child that Caleb's legacy was alive, safe, and flourishing. The revenge that had consumed months of my life had protected something far more enduring, the promise of hope, the preservation of Caleb's memory, and the tangible impact of his existence. Yet even in these moments, I felt the lingering shadows of my transformation. I had grown stronger, yes, but I had also become someone my younger self would scarcely recognize. Vigilant, strategic, capable of cold calculation, the innocence of grief had been replaced by a powerful awareness that the world could betray without warning, and that justice, if sought, often required darkness in return. I realized that survival was no longer enough. The foundation, the protections I had built, and the meticulous planning of revenge had shown me that power, patience, and awareness were necessary tools, not for cruelty, but for preservation. Caleb's name had become armor, a force guiding every step I took forward. In the end, I had reclaimed more than my son's legacy. I had reclaimed myself, sharpened by grief, tempered by betrayal, and strengthened by justice. The war had ended, yes, but its lessons, its scars, and its truths would remain, silent witnesses to a life transformed. And as I walked away from the cemetery that day, the sun casting long shadows across the ground, I knew that revenge had not just been about punishment. It had been about survival, about the quiet, deliberate assertion that no one could erase what I held most dear. Caleb's memory, his impact, and my love had endured. I had thought the war was over, the courthouse victories, the social unraveling of my parents, sister, and former friend. Everything had seemed final. Yet life has a way of reminding you that no victory is ever absolute, that even the most precise plans cannot account for every shadow. Months after the final confrontations, I received a letter. No return address, no signature, only a single typed line. "You won the battle, but not the war." I felt a cold tingle, a shiver that ran down my spine. At first, I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to some cruel prank, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Even in victory, I had learned one hard truth. Those who betray and those who hunger for power rarely vanish quietly. They linger, and their shadows can infect even the brightest light. Then came small signs. A misplaced document here, a social post that seemed pointed, whispers from contacts I trusted. Victoria had vanished from the public eye, yet she left traces, hidden threats embedded in seemingly innocent communications. Melissa was nowhere to be found, but a single email, sent anonymously, reminded me that she still remembered every humiliation. And my parents, I could feel their eyes on me in ways they thought impossible. Not physically, not openly, but in subtle moves. Questions asked of mutual friends, insinuations planted without daring to face me directly. It hit me then, in a moment of stark clarity. Revenge may dismantle them, but it does not erase the memory of their betrayal. It does not restore what was lost. It does not fill the hollow spaces carved by grief. What I had orchestrated, precise and brilliant as it was, had protected Caleb's legacy, yes, but it had also left me carrying a permanent reminder of the darkness I had navigated. And yet, even with this haunting knowledge, I felt a quiet resolution. The twist of life is that some wars are never truly over, but we can choose what they define. Caleb's foundation flourished. Families received help, children got treatment, and lives were changed. My enemies could whisper, plot, and lurk in shadows, but I had built something that could not be touched, something real, something enduring. I returned to Caleb's memorial wing one evening, walking quietly among the bright underwater murals, the laughter of children echoing softly through the halls. I placed my hand on his plaque, feeling the engraved letters under my fingers. I whispered a confession. I gave them justice, but I gave myself more. I survived. I endured. And I built something they will never touch. Yet the truth lingered, heavy and unshakable. Revenge, even when precise, leaves echoes. Those who wrong us may crumble, but the shadow they cast endures in us. I had learned to navigate it, to harness it, to turn it into purpose, but I could not deny its presence. And in the quiet, I realized the final lesson Caleb had taught me. Love endures beyond betrayal, beyond loss, beyond vengeance. That is the legacy that no greed, no lie, and no manipulation can ever touch. I walked away that night, not with triumph in my heart, but with clarity. The war had reshaped me, sharpened me, and hardened me, but it had also revealed a truth more important than revenge. Some victories are quiet, some are enduring, and some are haunted, but the life we build in their wake defines us far more than the battles themselves. And as I reached the door, I whispered one last promise to him. Your legacy lives, and nothing they do, nothing, will ever erase it. The shadows of betrayal remained, but I had learned to walk through them, not broken, not defeated, but steady, deliberate, and alive.